If you're a renter, are you also feeling the pinch of rent prices right now? With mortgage rates soaring and forcing many would-be homebuyers to back out of the housing market over the past year, demand for rentals is at the highest level on record, according to data from Realtor.com. As of January 27th, less than 6% of rental units were sitting vacant in the U.S. rental market. And along with demand, rent prices are still at historic highs despite recent declines seen around the country that range from 2% to 6%. In fact, one new study found that expensive rental costs are now burdening 44 million Americans from all over the nation. For the bottom 10% of income earners, rents are unaffordable in virtually every state of the country. Meanwhile, eviction rates are rising fast, and this time around, there are no policies in place to prevent an eviction tsunami. Advocates alert that the rent crisis is threatening to spark a national catastrophe. That's why, today, we've decided to analyze some incredibly shocking statistics about rental affordability in the U.S. that everyone should know. Before moving on, we kindly ask for your support with a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share this video with family and friends. While rent prices are breaking records, wage growth is currently flat. The latest numbers released by the Bureau of Labor Statistics show that weekly earnings for both men and women in the middle class were standing at $1,085 per week as of January 15th. Before taxes, that's about $4,340 of income per month, which means that middle-class households bringing in that amount would pay more than 41% of their income on rent. Official housing agencies say that anyone spending more than 30% of their income on rent is considered cost-burdened. That's to say, those workers may struggle to afford necessities, such as food and transportation. This also means that low-income workers are in extreme financial distress due to rent price increases, given that they need to spend about 55% of their income to pay for a one-bedroom rental currently listed on the market, according to estimates from the National Housing Coalition. In January, the average monthly rent affordable to a family of four with a household income at the poverty line was $694. In contrast, the average fair market rent for a one-bedroom rental home was $1,492 per month during that same period. For the bottom 10%, rent prices are out of their reach in virtually all of the states in the country. New research released by Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, JCHS, and Moody's Analytics has actually found that for the first time in more than 2 decades, every state now has low and middle-income renters who are nearing a financial breaking point as a result of low rent affordability. Almost half of Americans now struggle with a growing percentage of their incomes going towards keeping a roof over their heads. Rising mortgage rates cause many households to be priced out from home buying, would-be buyers to remain renters. Apartment demand surged as a result and drove rates sky high. As the disparity between rent growth and income growth widens, Americans feel financially squeezed as wage growth trails rent growth, researchers at Moody's wrote in the report. Harvard's JCHS went a step further by factoring race and poverty into the analysis. Renters living in communities of color and in high poverty and lower income were more likely to experience severe financial problems, it noted. More than 3/5 of renters behind on their housing payments lived in communities of color, while about 2/5 lived in high poverty or lower income neighborhoods, the group concluded. On top of that, the study reports that no states have an adequate supply of housing for low-income individuals, an alarming fact, especially in light of the uptick in the homeless population, which has grown by 32% since 2015. For renters whose income is at or below the poverty level, there's a shortage of affordable rental homes to the tune of 7 million, JCHS found. And while new multifamily construction is gaining momentum, most new construction is geared toward middle and upper income households, researchers say. The National Housing Coalition highlights that people need to earn $24.90 per hour to afford a rental home without spending more than 30% of their income, which is considered a general guideline for a healthy personal budget. But almost one-third, or 32% of the American workforce, earns less than £15 per hour. These workers are in a harrowing position of barely having enough income to cover rent, transportation to work, and food and utility costs. Although the Census Bureau finds that the average middle-class income in 2022 was $70,784, that same figure for low-income earners was only $26,247. This $44,000 income difference reflects the depth of the rental crisis the nation is facing. On average, according to the St. Louis Fed, low-income families owned about 21 cents per dollar of middle-class family wealth. These substantial gaps remain largely unchanged despite fluctuations from 1989 to 2022. Believe it or not, there was a time when a single full-time income could financially provide for families. But nowadays, most families are working harder than ever and still need at least two incomes to make financial ends meet. In 2022, there was no county, no metro area, no state where a person earning the federal or prevailing state or local minimum wage for a 40-hour work week could afford a two-bedroom rental home, Zillow data reveals. The federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, but some states, counties, and cities have established higher minimum wages. Still, there isn't a single U.S. county where a full-time minimum wage worker can afford a modest two-bedroom rental, analysts have stressed. For perspective, someone making $15 an hour would have to work 129 hours a week to cover the rent on a two-bedroom rental, now estimated to cost $1,940 per month. In San Diego, which has the second highest local minimum wage in the country at $16.30 per hour, just behind San Francisco at $16.32, it would take the income of more than three people earning minimum wage to afford a two-bedroom apartment. The real estate marketplace company said the average one-bedroom rental in America's finest city costs $1,962 a month, and the typical two-bedroom rental costs $2,468 a month. In other words, it would take 2.5 full-time jobs to afford a one-bedroom and 3.2 full-time jobs to afford a two-bedroom rental, according to Zillow. When analyzing the 50 largest U.S. cities, San Diego ranked number 22 for rent affordability based on minimum wage. Overall, 11 cities in Zillow's analysis require 3 or more full-time minimum wage workers to afford the typical one-bedroom rental. In response to these and other issues, a report by the National Economic Council recently issued the Renters' Bill of Rights to promote fairness for Americans living in rental housing. The document calls for safe, quality, accessible, and affordable housing, clear and fair leases, education, enforcement, and enhancement of renter rights, the right to organize, and eviction prevention, diversion, and relief. Over 44 million households, or roughly 35% of the U.S. population, live in rental housing, states the plan. And while federal laws such as the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and Fair Credit Reporting Act offer renters certain focused protections, there is no comprehensive set of federal laws protecting renters. Instead, our nation's rental market is defined by a patchwork of state and local laws and legal processes that renters and rental housing providers must navigate. Despite its righteous intentions, the newly released principles lack the authority to require implementation. The agency also will move toward requiring certain rental property owners to provide at least 30 days' notice if they plan to terminate the lease of a tenant due to non-payment of rent. Although evictions can appear to be a clear-cut issue, people who don't pay rent as agreed upon in their lease are removed from their property. The reality is much more complex. Unlawful evictions and landlords who use eviction filings to scare tenants compound an already perilous rental market. Eviction filings have already returned to pre-pandemic levels and, in some places, even exceeded them. With inflation and skyrocketing rent prices pushing many renters deeper into a financial hole, around 15% of tenants were behind on rent last month, a persistently high number, says Sophia Wadeen, a research analyst at the JCHS. Wadeen and her team also found evidence of rampant abusive eviction practices by 4 corporate landlords: Pretium, Invitation Homes, Ventron, and the Siegel Group. One of their illegal tactics was not adhering to the eviction moratorium rules or the federal rental assistance programs during the pandemic. The 4 companies filed a total of 14,744 eviction actions between March 15, 2020 and July 29, 2021. At the same time, these companies each displayed evidence of financial stability. Invitation Homes reported record profits, Pretium invested in significant expansions, Siegel experienced almost no revenue decline, and both Ventron and Siegel each received more than $2 million in forgiven Paycheck Protection Program funds, the report states. Conditions are dire, even for renters who are looking to move somewhere else, considering that new leases are costing them almost twice as much as renewals. Realtor.com reports that new leases are an additional $300 or more per month compared to $160 per month for renewing an existing lease. Prohibitively expensive rent hikes can trap renters in inadequate apartments or force them to forego being closer to work or school because it's too expensive to relocate, explains George Retu, the company's senior economist and manager of economic research. Many renters are finding themselves in a financially precarious situation. Their lease has reached that month-to-month status, but landlords are renewing these leases at much higher rates, Ratu adds. Hal Martin, a policy economist for the Program on Economic Inclusion at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, analyzed eviction data before and after the pandemic. One of the most notable results from the analysis was the link between the rise in evictions and the rise in rent prices. In cities where there was a 1% rent increase over the previous 3 months, there was a 2% increase in the eviction rate. There's a clear acceleration in evictions in places with higher rent growth, Martin says. It could be that if you have a tenant struggling to pay rent, the payoff to evict increases if you can raise the rent for the next tenant. While landlords have a right to maximize their rent profits, particularly in the face of rising inflation, renters are left with increasingly fewer options as affordable housing remains in short supply. Landlords, for their part, have been left to carry the burden of the state to provide housing for financially vulnerable renters. At this point, the national rental vacancy rate is hovering around 5.6%. That is the lowest since the mid-1980s, exacerbating an imbalance of supply and demand that's fueling runaway rent price hikes. A study by Rent Cafe exposed that in the fourth quarter, there were an average of 14 renters competing for one apartment. While illegal evictions certainly make the housing insecurity and homelessness crisis worse, the real culprit is the combination of an undersupply of affordable housing, poor wage growth, and a persistent lack of federal and state assistance to help both landlords and low-income tenants. For the past 40 years, U.S. workers have faced stagnant wages and loss of buying power. Yet the cost of rent has steadily climbed during that time, with sharp increases of 14% to 40% over the past 2 years alone. In the face of such a bleak scenario, the prophetic voice of Dr. King remains as timely as it is timeless. Do you know that most of the poor people in our country are working every day? They are making wages so low that they cannot begin to function in the mainstream of the economic life of our nation. These are facts which must be seen, and it is outrageous to have people working on a full-time basis and a full-time job getting part-time income, he said back in 1968. And it's safe to say that from that era until this very day, things have only gotten worse. Now, the rental affordability crisis and the growing threat of evictions in America paint a dire picture for millions of renters, putting them at risk of financial instability and losing their homes, and also further exacerbating an already dire situation. The consequences for the nation's most vulnerable citizens will be devastating, with overwhelming impacts that will be felt for years to come. This is a humanitarian crisis that demands immediate attention and decisive action. If our leaders do not act quickly, we risk leaving a legacy of inequality, insecurity, and homelessness for future generations to inherit.